Before we get started, just a reminder that you can find all of my available rental properties on my website at marcguzman.com. If you own investment property, click on the Owner Services section to see our complete list of services. Thank you to our sponsor for today's episode, East Brother Beer. Located on Canal Boulevard in Point Richmond, East Brother Beer mixes classic brewing styles with precision and modern sensibility to create the perfect Bay Area craft beer. This might shock you, but not everything you see in the movies is real. There really is not a real-life Infinity Gauntlet for you to snap your fingers with. But that doesn't mean movies have no themes or lessons that can actually translate to the real world. Our guest today is philosophy professor Yuen of Ohlone College in Fremont, who has helped publish many books about the various ethical lessons presented in movies. Today we talk with Professor Yuen about how movies and TV shows can teach us ethical real-world lessons and consequences. Wayne, thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Nice to be here.
So one question I'd like to ask every guest on the show is what currently has your attention?
Oh, well, I wish I could say something deep and meaningful like, world politics, impeachment or something like that. But I feel like I'm so burnt out on politics lately. It's lost my attention recently. So really the only thing that actually is grabbing my attention at the moment is Star Wars right now. I'm really excited by the movie coming out. I've got tickets for tomorrow. So jazzed about Star Wars right now. That's
nice.
about it.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of very mixed reviews about the people who've seen it so far. I think right now Rotten Tomatoes is like 58%, but it's like the critic score, which is like the critics, right? I mean,
absolutely.
You take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But
I'm not going to pretend that Star Wars is excellent cinema or anything like that. I think that it's it serves a certain kind of niche sort of role in our world, in particular,
especially right now.
Exactly. And it's nice to have just a little bit of escapism from things like politics and stuff like that. So, I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully it'll live up to all the hype. And even if it doesn't, though, I think I'm still going to enjoy it regardless.
Yeah, I was reading some reviews, and these are like hardcore Star Wars fans.
Yeah.
And some have said they've stepped up and walked out of the movie theater during the movie because it's that bad. But then there's other people saying, wait a minute. It could be a bad movie, but it's still going to be a great Star Wars movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's Star Wars.
Again, I think that the first movies, the original trilogy, especially the first one, it was, I think, in many ways just a sort of bad movie. I mean, the acting's terrible, the dialogue's awful, but you know what? Despite all of it, we still love it.
True. I mean, wasn't it Carrie Fisher's acting was heavily criticized after the first movie?
And I think she did most of the second and third movie high on cocaine or something like that too.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I've heard apparently.
In Return of the Jedi, if you look at her fingers, you can see her coat nail is shot from Jabba's palace.
Yeah. So again, I'm not going to defend it in terms of great cinema, but I think it was a fantastic place to sort of live in the imagination, play with a lot of ideas. I think that's it's a good metaphor for how we ought to live our lives in a lot of ways and stuff like that. But it's good fun.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
One of our prior guests, he mentioned that Star Wars is basically, if you compare it to like the Knights of the Round Table, it's very similar storyline, very similar plot line, except just with fancy lightsabers, high tech, and out in space.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people have talked about like how it's a modern retelling of the sort of hero's journey from Greek mythology and stuff like that. I think that in other ways, I think it touches on issues that a lot of the sort of classic mythology doesn't touch on, like diversity and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of striking if you just sort of think about Star Wars as a bunch of aliens living together mostly peacefully. I mean, definitely people have blaster fights in cantinas. But at the same time, you've got yourself a coalition of a diverse species working together against a united cause against imperial sort of injustice and stuff like that. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the theories too about the rebels being the true terrorists.
Oh, yeah.
Not really the heroes.
Yeah.
I thought that was a very interesting concept. When I first heard it, I said that can't be. But then as I started diving into their explanation and reasoning behind it, it made a lot of sense. I mean, the fact that they blew up a Death Star with thousands and thousands of workers.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about janitorial people, educators, dentists, and doctors on that Death Star.
Yeah. It is. Yeah, there's definitely some moral qualms to be considered when we're blowing up military installations like the Death Star and stuff like that. But I think some of those were sort of retconned out of existence with one of the newer movies, I think was Rogue One or something like that. But yeah, I think ultimately what we call good or bad is sort of determined by history in many ways. I mean, if you think about like the American Revolution, we were the rebels, and in many ways we were engaging in terroristic activities like the Boston Tea Party and stuff like that. And so really one person's freedom fighter is just another person's terrorist. It just depends on which side of the coin you happen to be on the issue. Right now we can kind of see the same thing happening in Hong Kong. If you're on the side of the Chinese government, then you see the Hong Kong uprising as a sort of rebellion and sort of a terroristic activities possibly that threatens the stability of the government and the nation. On the flip side, if you are on the side of the Hong Kong protesters, then they're the freedom fighters.
I guess good and bad is all very subjective depending on who you talk to, right? And we're all trying to figure out what's the best for everyone.
As an ethicist, I'd like to say that I think that ultimately, in many ways, good and bad is kind of subjective. But I'd like to also think that it's not as subjective as we'd like to think it is. I think that we can actually make reasonable arguments on one side or the other, saying that something is morally good or something is morally bad. I think, for example, it isn't just popular agreement that makes, say, something like slavery or beating your children or something like that morally wrong. But I think that we can actually give reasonable arguments to help us figure out why these things are morally wrong, and on the flip side, why other things might be morally right as well. Now,
let's get a little bit into your origin story and what led you up to teaching.
It's a interesting sort of story. I first got into philosophy pretty early in my college career. I sort of was planning on a different major, but that I kind of got sidetracked out of that because of just practical concerns, because I was going to major in, I think, I don't even remember what. But it was heavily impacted, and it wasn't likely that I was going to get into the program. And so I switched to philosophy just temporarily until something better came along, was what I told myself. And then I kind of fell in love with the discipline, and ethics in particular. Because when I was a kid, I felt like I looked at the world in a kind of black and white sort of way. I thought that morality was simple. And then I started taking my first ethics class, and I was just floored by how complicated it could be, and nuanced it is. And so that just started me diving deep into philosophy, trying to figure out a lot of these bigger questions. And I really enjoyed thinking about these bigger questions. And then somewhere towards like maybe 2 years into my undergrad, I kind of decided I think I was going to stay a philosophy major. And so I started thinking about teaching, because unfortunately there are not a lot of job opportunities for philosophy degrees. And so I started thinking about how I would explain this stuff to other people, start figuring out how I would teach this stuff and stuff like that. So I kind of early on decided that this was going to be a career for me, and that I liked the idea of teaching and getting people to think about these tough questions and guiding them towards answers, or at least possible answers.
After high school, I went to Solano Community College and took a psychology course out there, and also philosophy course. And I thought just having one semester of those classes were extremely helpful. I mean, for the rest of my life, just because it really opens up your way of thinking, and not that you become an expert by just taking one semester, even though there are people that think they're experts after one semester, but it forces you to admit that there's other ways of thinking, and your way of thinking is not always, or may not be, the correct way of thinking. And it really forces you to explore other people's ideas and their mindset and their reasoning behind what they believe, which I think is super helpful in today's world, because now, I mean, we've seen, going back to politics, it's so divisive. No one wants to figure out why the other side believes what they believe, and one of the arguments is, how can you stand behind this one person if you know how wrong he is in one aspect, right?
Right.
And if you have these intelligent conversations with people instead of just an all-out war with them, it's very interesting to hear some of their reasoning and how, well, maybe their thinking isn't what you thought it was.
Right.
And then you start to come to terms, you learn about the person a bit more. And I think that's super helpful in life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that philosophy gives us a kind of perspective on a lot of different things, including different positions out there, different sort of positions on social issues, moral issues, political issues. And it also gives us a way to sort of reasonably evaluate how people's positions on these divisive issues. I think a lot of times people throw their hands up in the air and say, oh, it's all relative, it's all just purely subjective, because they don't have the skills to be able to sort of really sort of deeply analyze these positions and think about them in a more critical fashion. And so since people sort of generally lack these skills, they just kind of give up and just say, well, it's just everyone's opinion and it doesn't really matter. But I think in the case of politics in particular, it's a good example of how, even though they might be these issues may be ultimately subjective, it does have material impacts on people, and what we believe actually does matter.
It'd be great to see philosophy courses taught in elementary, middle school, high schools. I mean, it'd be great, because there could be a lot of young adults or students, kids that really take it and start to form their own ideas. I think we'd see a much better place in terms of communication.
Oh yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. I would love to see philosophy being taught earlier. Unfortunately, I think that it's given our sort of national sort of priorities and such, I don't think that that's going to be happening anytime soon. But ultimately, I think that the whole point of a free education system is to prepare our citizens to be critical thinkers so that they can make reasonable choices at the ballot box.
One of the issues in public schooling is parents saying, well, I don't want you putting ideas in my kid's head. Right. And it's funny, because they then force their own ideas into their kids' heads. Right. And so I have noticed that there seems to be a trend of different unique schools that are developing, that are making students meditate, making them really study and look into philosophy, coming up with their own ideas. And that's a very unique, I don't know if there's a word for those type of schools or what category they would fall into, but it's very interesting to see some of those schools popping up and more students going into that type of schooling. Yeah,
there's a lot of experimentation going on in education right now, especially in the sort of lower levels, elementary levels and stuff. And it's interesting to see that we're at least willing to experiment. I'm all for that. My worry is that I think a lot of the experimentation might be going on in places that take away from public schools education. And I think that in order to ensure a kind of equity to everybody, from rich and the poor, from the sort of and of different racial ethnicities and stuff like that, that we need to make sure that all students at least have a way to access these kinds of experiments, find a kind of educational system that is best for them, without necessarily also robbing the chance or opportunity of other individuals at, say, the public schools systems from getting a good education as well.
That's so true, because then you can create a whole new set of elitists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the internet, though, has really helped a lot of people access a lot of information. And that's one thing I've mentioned on this show with some prior guests. It's amazing to see a lot of the young adults and students so actively involved in knowing about politics and a lot of social issues currently going on, not just in the United States, but other countries. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was in middle school, there was no way, like no kids were talking about politics. No kids were talking about water rights in other countries. Mm-hmm. No kids were talking about anything other than the current music that they were listening to or a video game, right? Yeah. Nowadays, if you ask a 5th grader or 6th grader what they think of the current political system, they've got a pretty good answer for you.
Oh, yeah.
And it's amazing.
Yeah, no, I think that the internet is a fantastic tool. It's made, it gives everybody basically a bullhorn to talk about their issues that are important to them. It gives people access to high quality resources so that we can understand the facts about a situation or scenario. And it, a case in point, Greta Thunberg, Times Person of the Year, is possibly changing the world because, she has an outlet like the internet to be able to help educate people and spur on advocacy for the environment in this case.
I believe she's the youngest Time Person of the Year, right?
I believe so, yeah. But at the same time, I think we should also be wary of the internet as well, because as easy it is to put out facts, it's also quite as easy to put out misinformation, and for certain ideologies to sort of find one another, people of differing certain ideologies to find one another, which is also a good thing in some ways. But if the ideology is a sort of toxic ideology, then it may just help reinforce that toxic ideology. So it cuts both ways.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's funny you say that, because this morning I was having a discussion with a few friends and I wanted to go on the internet to pull up an article that I knew, okay, let me send you this article. It's a good read. It's going to give more context to what I'm saying. However, and it was around politics and Clinton Foundation, DNC. And so I'm looking for this article. I go to Google and there's so many different websites that come up and you're just bombarded with all these different articles, but half of these have already been debunked.
Right.
They're still out there.
Right.
And so a lot of that disinformation, once it's out there and people don't remove it.
Right. And I think that goes right back to critical thinking skills. I think that we need, especially in this time and age where we have access to all of this information, that we need to be able to sort of differentiate between good information and bad information, and know how to do that. I think.
Well, good thing Facebook's doing that for us, right?
Well, I think a good example of this might be actually the KKK website. If you didn't know that they have a website, and it's really an interesting read because you can see how they twist and bend their ideology into something that sounds attractive. It sounds justified. And so I encourage everyone to go onto the KKK website, know what it is, and just take a look at how they present themselves. Not to say that I encourage people to be KKK members. Of course I don't. But I think it's a lesson in how we communicate ideas. Ideas can be presented in ways that seem attractive, but actually hide something that's more menacing underneath, depending on just how we package it.
Yeah, humanity and society in the next 50 to 100 years will be very interesting, because if just in business alone, I'm seeing more and more automation in my real estate property management business, And as automation happens, it literally eliminates positions of a lot of workers.
Sure.
However, the position that does not get eliminated are those critical thinkers that are able to then say, okay, let me manage this or come up with a different way, or how do I create the automation bot, right? Those critical thinkers are going to be the key to the future and to businesses, our society. And so it's going to be interesting because in all aspects, that's going to be required. And that's the one thing that I see lacking from public education is the critical thinking. It's a lot of memorizing what's in the book, regurgitating it. Do you memorize it to pass the test? You know, how many people talk about they don't remember what they learned 6 months ago or, 6 years ago? Happens all the time.
Yeah, I think that students, generally speaking, look at the education system in the wrong way, actually. And I think it's true for a lot of people, actually, not just students, because I don't think that the education system that we currently have is really built to inform. And that, I think, is what people think an education is I'm learning a bunch of facts. And so once I learn these facts and I spit them back out on the exam, I'm done, and I don't have to remember these things anymore because we don't. That's just being human. But instead, I think what most students are missing is that it's not the facts that you learn for, a few weeks and then forget later. That is the point of education or college or whatever. But the ultimate point of education is developing you as a person, developing you as a critical thinker, developing you as a person who can work together in groups, a person who has good time management skills, a person who can meet deadlines, a person who can juggle a lot of different sort of projects all at once, et cetera, et cetera. Education, I think, especially a college education, is really more bent towards making a good, productive worker, rather than turning you into a well-educated person. Ideally speaking, in the grand scheme of things, I think that we should aim for being a well-educated person, which I define not as, having a bunch of knowledge, but rather being able to think well, be able to find resources, be able to learn about the things that knowing how to access the information so that you can learn about the things that you want to or are interested in learning about, rather than, say, being able to recite the Declaration of Independence off the top of your head or something like that.
Yeah. Now, as students are taking your ethics course, what's the ultimate goal that you want, the ultimate takeaway for your students?
My ultimate takeaway in my ethics course is I want students to know how to think about reasoning about ethical issues and such and stuff like that. I try to present issues in ways so that I'm not forcing a particular position onto them. My best example, I think, is that I teach a section on vegetarianism in my class. And personally, I'm a vegetarian, but right after I present vegetarianism, I present another essay about how we should actually eat more animals. And if you care about the welfare of animals, and I think there's actually a really compelling argument behind that. And so I try to get people to think about whatever it is that they are whatever it is that they believe. I genuinely don't think my job is to tell you what is right or wrong, but I think it's, at the very least, my job is to challenge your beliefs and values so that people reflect and think and possibly change their values and beliefs. If our values are good values, then they should stand up to scrutiny and examination. And if they're bad values and they don't stand up to scrutiny and evaluation, then why should we be holding these values, right? We should change them. And I think that's something I learned early on in my sort of philosophical career, is that for a lot of people, we hold our values and our beliefs close to us. We kind of identify ourselves with our beliefs and ideas and values. We think, when you attack my beliefs and ideas, you're attacking me. And philosophy really drills that out of a person. It really tells you that you are something separate from your values and beliefs, and that everyone's values and beliefs change over time. and through examination, and we should be open to it because only a handful of people will ever be born with quote unquote the correct beliefs and value systems, and never have to ever change their ideas and beliefs. So we should be
And you could also argue that no one's ever born with the correct belief values, because if you take one person from the U.S., put them into a different country, completely different, you're already wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. At least wrong for in relationship to the majority there.
Correct.
And so we have to be able to examine our values, be able to question them, and be open to being questioned. I think that's an attitude that we should all sort of invite. The possibility that our values could be wrong.
Now, how do you use movies in your ethics course? And why do you use movies?
Well, so I think popular culture tends to get a bad rap, generally speaking, because people look at it and just say, it's just sort of trivial, banal sort of stuff. But we forget that what we call classical literature today, and it was popular culture of the day way back when. And so I think popular culture does a lot of different things. It reflects ourselves, it reflects our society, and poses us questions that may not be easy to deal with on a sort of day-to-day level, but in a sort of science fiction universe, in a fantasy universe, in a just fictional universe, it's a lot more digestible. It's a lot easier to see someone else struggle with difficult ideas than for us to struggle with difficult ideas personally. We just tend to shut off and just think, well, whatever opinion is right, because morality is subjective. But if we really go by the idea that, so back up. So to talk about popular culture and morality gives us a way to sort of talk about a scenario or an idea without necessarily having to have the sort of danger of it being too, quote unquote, real. But at the same time, we are dealing with real issues. And it gives people a way to talk about and engage in these ideas in a meaningful way without it being boring, drab, scary, and at the same time, it gives us a sort of common ground to start, right? Because I think generally speaking, movies and popular culture tends to give us a common starting point. This is how we should think of things. So here's the good guy, here's the bad guy, here's how it resolves, game over. And then after the movie, we can say, was that really how things should have resolved?
Do you have a philosophy on mobster movies, mafias? Why are they so popular? Why do humans, the general population, why do we connect with these characters that we know they're doing morally bad things, right? Mm-hmm. And 99% of us would never be able to have that mindset, mentality, the lifestyle, yet we idolize them in movies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that goes more to the sort of heart of a sort of larger sort of cultural shift, because early in at least Hollywood sort of history, they would make really sort of black and white sort of morality plays. And then came The Godfather and all the great mafia movies. And they start introducing these anti-heroes, these villains who are actually our protagonists that we're supposed to sort of root for. And it gives us, I think, a better look at real life, I think, because as much as we'd like to think that morality is easy, I think that morality isn't quite as easy as we'd like it to be. Sure, there are easy questions about, like, should I murder this person or not? Obviously, the answer is no, typically. But
typically,
well, I generally don't think that. I generally think that murder is wrong, but it may be the case that it is justified in some instances or circumstances, depending on how we define murder. But generally, I don't think that killing is always wrong. I think that context makes a big difference. For example, I don't think a lot of us are wringing our hands, morally speaking, over, say, the killing of Osama bin Laden. But basically that was, some guy just hanging out in his house, and then SEAL Team 6 comes in and kills him and dumps his body into the ocean. Now, I think that's strangely enough morally justified on some levels, but it's a killing. Now, was it murder? It would ultimately depend on how we define murder. But for example, back to the mob movies, they often frame murder and killings in mob movies as justified because of other considerations, other goals, other contexts, you're threatening the family. And I think often we talk about in our general culture that if, someone came into my house and threatened my family, I would feel justified in murdering that person. And so we can kind of see a bit of ourselves in these mob movies because we are willing to do just about anything given the right circumstances and scenarios. And what I would want us to do as a philosopher is ask ourselves, is it really justified? Does, for example, self-defense or acting in a defense of our family justify just about anything? Or are there moral limits to that as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. As you were saying that, I was just thinking of the movie Goodfellas, and where Joe Pesci is very quick to pull the trigger and just kill anyone, yet the other characters that are mobsters look at Joe Pesci as, oh, this guy's a little crazy, a little too much.
Right.
Even though they've also killed people, but they even look at him like, hey, this guy might be a little too much.
Right.
So even themselves are dealing with that same internal battle of, at what point does it become wrong? Right.
There's a often the mob movies depict a kind of internal moral sort of code of proper killing, and you're supposed to do this and that, and you're not supposed to break these sort of hard and rigid sort of codes. And I think morality and characters like Joe Pesci and Goodfellas really sort of have us question, are moral codes so inflexible that they can never be violated, right? And so going back to the question, is all murder wrong? I think that's an interesting sort of attitude to adopt, that we should be really skeptical about whether or not we can make any kind of moral claim that's genuinely universal. I think there might be a handful of universal moral claims that are almost always true, or if not always true. But they tend to be few and far between. I think off the top of my head, don't torture people and don't rape people. I think those might be my only two sort of universal moral claims. And beyond that, I think it might be that the context and situations really determine whether or not some particular act is actually morally acceptable or not.
Now, you've written some books and essays on several movies and ethics. If someone wanted to go find one of your books, read one of your essays, where can they do that?
I've edited a few books on philosophy and certain pop culture franchises, in particular, The Walking Dead and philosophy. I have 2 books on that. You can find them on Amazon. They're from Open Court Press. You could just Google my name into Amazon. You might be able to find actually almost all my essays that I've published on pop culture. I've done The Walking Dead and philosophy, 2 volumes on that. I've done, I co-edited a volume on the Rick and Morty in philosophy, and I did one on Neil Gaiman in philosophy. And so I think they're a lot of fun to do. They're all works of sort of passion rather than of requirements or anything like that. But I think that they're fun reads. I think they're ways for us to engage in something that we all love, whether it be zombies or, an author or something, and think a little more deeply about some of the issues that they raise, or use some scenarios or situations in these franchises to talk about deeper philosophical issues.
Okay, so I do have to ask you, please summarize the Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty is a fantastic show. I love it. There's a lot of existentialist sort of thought in it. The questions about existence and what the point of life is. Rick is clearly a kind of nihilist who rejects kind of any kind of religion and sort of organized sort of meaning. He's kind of like the ultimate empiricist, ultimate scientist. And he doesn't seem to care about morality in a lot of different ways. But at the same time, we've got Morty, who is kind of like us, the audience, asking all these questions about, life, values, and he's unduly influenced by his grandpa Rick, which I think is sort of what happens to a lot of students when they first start looking at philosophy. They're just like, wow, and they get depressed. But the show's sort of structure allows them to explore a lot of different sort of ideas because they're not limited by this reality. They get to visit alternate realities and such.
What'd you think of that whole reaction to the Szechuan sauce a couple years back?
Yeah, that was really interesting. It shows how, I think, one, we take pop culture really seriously, that some throwaway idea or some throwaway joke in one episode of Rick and Morty, in this case, can have serious impacts in the real world. I think McDonald's released the Szechuan sauce for about a week, and then people were lining up and trying to get it. And when McDonald's ran out, people rioted and stuff like that. And so I think that it takes a certain catalyst to get people to become suddenly really passionate about something. And it could be something as simple as a cartoon versus something as deep as, say, global warming or something like that, climate change. But yeah, because Rick and Morty can touch on so many different topics, like from animal rights to organ donation or something like that, it's a really great show to think about philosophically, because every episode you're going to get something radically different.
Do you think we're taking too much of our culture from or too much of our morals from TV shows these days?
Yeah, I do kind of worry that we take our morals from television a little too seriously, because I think that we are looking at morality from a sort of singular lens, and we're not looking at it from a critical perspective. If we say, oh, look, this is what Rick did, and so it must be right, I think that we should remind ourselves that Rick is a kind of tragic character. We don't want to be Rick. He's a sad, sort of drunken person who constantly is trying to ease his existential pain by drugs and alcohol and parties and weird Kyberian crystals or whatever. So I think that if we're going to take moral direction from, say, Rick and Morty, then I think that we need to be able to ask ourselves, well, why should we believe that Rick is right? Is Rick actually right? And that's where I think we can start a discussion. Like, for example, I think there was in the Rick and Morty in Philosophy book that I edited. I wrote a chapter on organ donation, and there was around this episode where Jerry is injured at a sort of intergalactic hospital, and the doctors want to harvest his penis and transplant it into this alien who is a sort of social activist who has made billions of people's lives better. And so should we sacrifice our penises to save this alien? And we don't have to take that situation seriously, obviously, because rarely will we be asked to give up our penises to save the world. But we can take that a little more seriously by saying, well, we could give our blood, and that could save another person's life. We could possibly donate our kidneys and save another person's life. And the question is, should we? Do we have an obligation to? I believe the episode resolves by Jerry wanting to give his penis at the end, but it's not necessary, and he kind of feels like he's tragically denied the opportunity to help or make an impact or redeem himself morally by giving his penis up. But I think that we're all in a sort of position, kind of like Jerry, where we can donate our blood, and are we willing to distinguish ourselves morally by donating or not donating?
Wayne, I want to thank you for being on the show. It was a great episode. Lots of really fun conversations, and we'll have to have you back on again.
Oh, yeah, this is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thanks.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubin. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at marcguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.